Welcome everybody this nice and sunny afternoon. So thank you that you arrived here at the university. My name is Magdalena Staruszewska and I'm the director of the German Historical Institute here in Warsaw, which is, for those of you who don't know, a German research institution based here in Warsaw, and we do mainly research on East Central European history, and we've been organizing these so-called Tuesday lectures for many, many years. Actually, I don't know how many, but at least decades. And for the first time now we are co-organizing these lectures together with the Faculty of History of the University of Warsaw, and also in these very nice rooms of the university. And this semester we devoted the lectures to the topic of so-called toxic relations, and we are focusing on the history of violence, especially family and gender violence throughout the centuries. So we started with a lecture about violence in the medieval times and femicide in the medieval times, and we are now finishing with a lecture on violence in very recent times. With Konrad Ota as our distinguished guest from Prague, who will be later introduced by Piotr Majewski. Dobrokna Kauva is the host here at the university. So
I'm just a deputy of dean, so this is a little bit different position. Yeah, so it's a, but yeah, I gladly cooperated with Magdalena to organize these meetings here at the university. Due to our seminar of gender, we also are interested in history, gender, violence, and whatever else. Mm-hmm.
And thanks so much for Piotr Majewski here from the faculty, who is specializing in, how do you say Zeitgeschichte in English? Contemporary history, thank you so much. And also Czech history. Piotr was so kind to play the role of the moderator today. So Piotr, the floor is yours, and thank you also Ota for coming.
Thank you for inviting me and us here. It's my pleasure to chair this lecture and discussion later on, and I'm very pleased to welcome here Ota Konrád, who is a very famous Czech historian who works at the Charles University and whose scientific career has been connected with the Charles University since your MA thesis, I guess.
Then very
so
stable person.
Yes, exactly. What is also quite popular in Poland, by the way. Ota Konrád wrote his PhD thesis about humanities in National Socialism, a comparison of the universities of Leipzig, Vienna, and Prague. Then he delivered his habilitation, the second doctorate, about uneven relations, Czechoslovakia and Austria, 1918-1933. And more recently, he has worked on topics related to violence, especially with the violence during the Great War, thereafter. He co-authored with Rudolf Kučera monograph Paths Out of the Apocalypse, Physical Violence in the Fall of and Renewal of the Central Europe 1914-1922, and also co-edited 2 volumes on post-war violence under the title In the Shadow of the Great War, Physical Violence in East Central Europe 1917-1923. And Ota Konrád also leads PhD program in the modern history at the Charles University. He attended or worked as the visiting professor at the University of Regensburg in the Centre d'Histoire des Sciences Po and l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. And in 2021, he was a research fellow also at the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation at the University of Munich. He right now he researches domestic violence and its context in post Second World War Czechoslovakia and in Western Germany as well. And he analyzes complex post-war social and political reconstruction from this point of view. And we are very curious to listen about this topic from you today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Piotr. Thank you for coming and for inviting me to, and also thank you for the opportunity to speak at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw, of course, and also at the University of Warsaw, the Faculty of History, and also within this lecture series about, as already mentioned, about the gendered violence and so on. So I would like to present and to speak about my current research, as already mentioned, on domestic violence in post-war Czechoslovakia and West Germany after 1945. I mean, from 1945 till approximately till the 1980s, and I will also try to discuss and present the structure and the main ideas of my book, which I'm which I'm writing right now. I'm trying, but I'm also writing, and so for me it's also, I think it's very 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 nice, very important possibility and opportunity to present this book, this research, and also to discuss it with you, and also hopefully to get some feedback and so on. So that's my idea. I would like just to speak about my research, about my book, and I will be very curious about to hear your comments, to your questions, and also to your feedback. First, a very basic PowerPoint. First, I would like to start with something different. I would like to say a few, not only few, I would like to say something about why I decided to devote myself to this topic, so to the topic of domestic violence. Well, it's because I think this may also shed some light on my specific approach to this, but on my approach to this, to the research of the history of domestic violence. Unlike most works on this subject, especially those from the early phase of professional historical interest and research on domestic violence, which began as we know to emerge in the 1980s, I don't start from a position of some social activism. I came to the topic of domestic violence rather as a scholarly problem, as an academic problem. My previous project, as already mentioned by Piotr, also dealt with violence, but with collective violence. Above all, with more or less spontaneous, violent demonstrations of different scale on the home front during the First World War in the Habsburg monarchy. This kind of violence included hunger demonstrations, riots, looting, but also clashes of lesser intensity and scope. Following post-colonial studies, this type of violence can be analyzed as the political language of subaltern subjects. In the case of the Czech or Austrian home front, these were, of course, not colonial subjects. These were Czechs, Germans, Austrians, but these were often politically, socially, or ethnically marginalized strata of the population. At a time when the basic forms of political representation were breaking down during the war, and the state itself was gradually disintegrating these groups were losing the possibility of political participation and of articulating their interests as well as their fears and prejudices, and were seeking new ways to speak, and this new way how to speak was the way of violence. So the violence in which they sometimes engaged was therefore enacted from the outset in public or semi-public spaces, in streets, squares, markets, shops, or on roads. It was thus visible, the violence was visible from the very beginning and became the object of intense interest on the part of the state, especially its repressive organs. This is also why it is relatively well documented for the historian. It's why I also was able to research this kind of violence. This type of violence, as already mentioned, also gave rise to a specific language. By this, I don't mean only language in the narrow sense, the various shouts, cries, slogans, verbal commands that often accompany these explosions of violence on the home front, but more broadly, language as a system of signs that makes it possible to articulate specific meanings. So the main idea, and I'm still speaking about my last project, the main idea of my interpretation of this type of violence was therefore not to look at the act of violence itself as an only pathological explosion of anger, one that has no meaning and signifies only destruction, whether of bodies or things, but rather as a linguistic system of articulation and communication, the decoding of which makes it possible to uncover a surprisingly differentiated understanding of the actors themselves, of the world, of the political and social order, and so on. At the same time, I understood violence as a constructive practice, as a constructive force, in which violence itself helps or seeks to help bring these ideas into being. So one example which I like, one example from this last research, when for example hungry women waiting in line for food physically attacked a passing member of the upper classes because he was fat. This was not irrational behavior. It expressed ideas about who belongs to us, to the community of people shaken and starved by war, and who is the enemy. So the enemy, so those who, at the expense of these ordinary people, had selfishly secured access to food to such an extent that their exceptional social position and power were reflected directly in their physical appearance, so they were fat. It was both the communication, this violence, this attack of these women against this attack of these women was both the communication and the realization of specific and complex ideas about morality and a just social order. So I offer this somewhat maybe long and extended introduction because domestic violence began to interest me precisely as the counterpart of such public collective violence. In many respects, it is in fact the complete opposite of collective violence on the home front during the war and in the post-war period, and it resists the application of the approaches and perspectives through which I had examined that type of violence. So, and I tried to summarize, and now I will try to summarize this. No, that's okay. That's what I'm going to speak about. So I tried to summarize some of these features of both types of violence in this slide. So domestic violence is, by definition, of course, not violence in public space. It can, of course, appear there. A husband, for example, may humiliate or beat his wife even in the street. But public space is not the main framework of this type of violence. It doesn't shape it, doesn't give it its own meaning or motivation, and doesn't prompt the perpetrator to formulate a specific language of violence. Second, in the case of domestic violence, the act of violence itself is not, for my historical research, significant. Or rather, it is not significant in the sense that its form would be the main object of analysis. Of course, this doesn't mean that the violence itself is not is unimportant. On the contrary, of course, it is very important, and it is of profound significance to those who experience it. The modes and forms of especially physical aggression within domestic violence are, however, relatively limited and change very little over time. Unlike public collective violence, they don't form a specific, often highly complex and inventive language that could itself become the object of analysis. This is, of course, due precisely to its non-public character. There is no immediately present big audience, no direct recipients, listeners, or spectators of the violence. Third, this is also connected to the fact that domestic violence, unlike public violence, is often not apparent. In many cases, it is not even perceived as violence. And therefore, fourth, its archival traces are often inconspicuous, hidden, and fragmented, unlike the traces of riots and demonstrations during the war. For example, it was clear for the observators, for police and so on, that this was the violence. So that's one like difference to many cases of domestic violence. In these cases, it was not clear and that it was a violence. This, of course, creates specific difficulties for its historical study, for the historical study of domestic violence. And last, domestic violence is not violence as the speech of subaltern subjects. Of course, that would be very so it's not the speech of subaltern subjects. Power, of course, is present in this kind of violence as it is in all violence, but its principle is different from that of collective riots and violent demonstrations during the First World War. So I tried just to introduce you and myself to the topic and to explain that one needs to change the approach to the study of violence when studying, for example, this collective violence, and then when researching the domestic violence. So these differences require a completely different approach to the historical analysis of domestic violence. This analysis of domestic violence is important and interesting also more generally for the discussion of what violence actually is, what place, function, and meaning it has in modern societies, and how historians can study it. It was precisely these questions that led me to an interest in researching the history of domestic violence. So to make my approach more clear, I would like to introduce again one concrete case from 1980s Czechoslovakia. Jarmila, and I'm using names, and of course these names are not the original names of the victims or of the perpetrators, but I just names which I gave to these people. Jarmila, because of the anonymity and so on. Jarmila was a young woman who lived with her two children in a small town on the Bohemian-Moravian border in the so-called Českomoravská Vrchovina, which is very rural, more or less rural region. In 1976, she divorced her violent husband, Karel, an alcoholic. Because of the cramped housing conditions, difficult housing conditions, typical of socialist Czechoslovakia in the 1970s and 1980s, 1960s, 70s. However, she was forced to continue living with him, with Karel, in the same apartment even after the divorce. Karel continued to beat Jarmila. His attacks escalated after he returned from prison, where he had been sent in connection with other criminal offenses. Even after Jarmila and her children managed finally to move to another apartment in the neighborhood, the violence didn't stop. Karel repeatedly raped his former wife. What is interesting is that the neighbors must have known about the beatings, because Jarmila was often covered in bruises, and the noise from the apartment could not have gone unheard. The local pediatrician also knew about it, or I think she must knew about it. After one of the rapes, Jarmila came to see the local pediatrician, to see her with her children, who were frightened by what had happened during the night. A formal investigation, however, was launched only after Jarmila filed repeated reports with the local police. It took more than a year before Karel was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison because of this violence. Jarmila's case was not exceptional in socialist Czechoslovakia, nor is the testimony of a neighbor, certain Mr. B, let's call him B, is also not as exceptional, his testimony. Mr. B was a so-called inspector of public order. I don't know if maybe something similar existed also in socialist Poland, but in Czechoslovakia it was like inspector of public order. Like these people were volunteers from among the local population. They were often nicknamed Grey Plague. And this Mr. B, this inspector of public order, was well informed about Karel's behavior and was one of the neighbors of Karel. I quote, "At first," he stated during the investigation, "I thought that Jarmila or her mother and relatives were exaggerating Karel's behavior, that they wanted to get him sent to prison. I thought that even though I knew he beat her, he was not like that. I believed him. Only after some time and after several repeated incidents he had witnessed as this inspector of public order, did he, and I quote again, did he gradually become convinced that what Jarmila and her relatives were saying was true. These seemingly contradictory statements by Mr. B, he said he knew that Karel beat Jarmila, yet thought he was not like that, deserve attention. One of the main features of domestic violence is usually considered to be its hidden character, connected to the physical characteristics of the spaces in which this violence takes place. The walls of neighboring apartments protect privacy, but at the same time they hide violent behavior from the eyes of others. In reality, however, many or several cases I have been able to study show that at least some degree of knowledge or awareness of abuse existed within the wider family and in the immediate as well as more distant neighborhood, that is, beyond the walls of the apartments in which the violence occurred. In some cases, as with Jarmila, neighbors and the wider community had relatively precise information about this behavior, or it even occurred before their eyes. Domestic violence, however, is not only a concrete physical act, and factual visibility doesn't mean social visibility. So the factual visibility doesn't mean social visibility. For social visibility, for the latter to emerge, an act of physical aggression must be transformed into visible, recognizable violence and knowledge as such by others. In the social process, factors external to the act itself play a crucial role. For example, how the perpetrator presents himself to others, or how the community responds to him. In the case of Mr. B, and presumably of several other neighbors as well, the problem was not that they didn't know about the beatings, because, for instance, they were hidden behind the walls of the apartment where Jarmila lived with her children. Their knowledge was more than sufficient. The problem was that they didn't assign to this behavior the meaning of unacceptable violent conduct that could, or perhaps even should, prompt intervention by the surrounding community or by state institutions. So what interests me on domestic violence then is not its quantity. Sometimes I'm asked about the quantity of what I don't know about the quantity of about the incidents, the number of incidents of I don't know, and it's not for me. It's not important. What interests me about the topic of domestic violence is not its quantity, it's not its concrete forms, not the motivations of perpetrators or ways of defending against it, although these are of course relevant and legitimate questions as well. But what interests me is domestic violence as a social phenomenon. The key question for me is not whether someone knew about violence, but whether this knowledge was socially recognized as knowledge of violence requiring a response. How, under what circumstances and under what conditions does an act, especially an act of physical aggression, become a socially visible and socially recognized phenomenon that we call violence? What discourses and practices and social practices give this specific act the meaning of violence? What I'm interested in then is a kind of historical social phenomenology of violence. I understand violence as something not self-evident, not something that is simply there, but something that must be first recognized as violence, acquire the meaning of violence, and pass through a process of social visibilization. This process, which I think is maybe somehow important and somehow like typical for all kinds of violence, but this process I think can be illuminated particularly well in the case of domestic violence as a specific extreme form of violence, one in which contemporaries often faced the very question of whether it was violence at all. It also follows from this approach that in my research I don't want to follow the traditional interpretative scheme that may be called, I don't know, maybe called like the victorious narrative. In this narrative, the history of domestic violence is understood as a more or less direct path from invisibility and silence to the present, in which domestic violence is, for the most part, socially visible and recognized and becomes, albeit still insufficiently, of course, a topic of public discussion, as we are just right now discussing it, moral condemnation and specific policies and norms and legislative norms. I don't want to frame my research through this narrative either, because it derives mainly from the first foundational historical and sociological works of the 1980s and 1990s and originated in a Western context and in the experiences of the developed Western world, especially the United States, Australia, and Great Britain. From this perspective, developments in other parts of the world, for example in the countries of the former Soviet bloc, can subsequently appear as a detour, a deviation, a lag, and so on. So I'm not saying that this is wrong in itself, that this narrative is wrong in itself. Rather, what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't seem to me to be a suitable analytical framework for historical research, which should be very cautious about the temptations of anachronism and should seek to understand the past from within itself, while of course remaining aware of all the possible aporias and limitations of this imperative of historiography, so to understand history from within itself. It was precisely the rejection of this victorious and primarily Western-based narrative that also led me to expand my research, which that originally focused only on the Czech case, into a Czech-German or Czech-West German or Czech-Bavarian comparison across the Iron Curtain. I hope that this approach, which is quite difficult of course, but I hope that this approach will make it possible to capture how the specific political and social conditions, very different in both cases, so how these specific political and social conditions in these two societies shaped the everyday reality of domestic violence and the ways in which it was addressed. These conditions differed, of course, significantly as the two societies embarked after the war on often radically different paths of post-war reconstruction. At the same time, the analysis will also seek to identify the limits of their influence of these different like political frameworks on the everyday practice and acknowledging of domestic violence. So my research focuses primarily on the everyday reality of domestic violence, on how it was perceived and how it was handled by its immediate actors and their surroundings, including local, what we can call meso-elites, such as representatives of schools, teachers, local government, municipal government, municipal like self-government, physicians, representatives of local state administration and its repressive organs like police, and the lowest levels of the judicial system. I therefore work above all with sources from which I hope to gain insight into this world, although such insight is of course very limited. The empirical core of my research consists of criminal case files. I also work with police documents, materials from local administration, and materials from various organizations and institutions established by local authorities and the like. I also work partly with some ego documents, but that's very, of course, difficult to get these ego documents, such as letters written by some victims to various state institutions or to the press. The book I'm working on has, or I think, should have 4 main chapters, each of which should have a different actor. Maybe the next slide, a different actor. The first chapter focuses on the post-war period as a specific actor, as a specific framework of social visibility of domestic violence or invisibility. The second on society and local ties. The third on institutions, and the fourth on victims as actors. And in the second part of my lecture, I will try to describe a little bit more in detail the ideas behind these four chapters. So the first chapter focuses on the post-war period in both countries. Here the post-war is the main actor. I'm interested in how it manifested itself in domestic violence and how it shaped its social visibility. I understand the post-war period as a specific period that, despite the different paths taken by Czech and West German societies, they shared some features in both cases. This concerns, above all, a specific temporality. Contemporaries understood the post-war period as a transitional period between a war that was already over, but whose effects were still felt every day, and hopes for the future, which in both cases meant the building of radical new societies. Of course, the experience and the consequences of the war, the shape of the first post-war years, and above all, the building of new post-war societies differed in many aspects, in many respects, in the Czech as in the West German cases. From a general perspective, however, I think the visibility and perception of domestic violence in both Czech and West German society were shaped by precisely this tension, this temporary this tension between past and future. According to the traditional victorious interpretation, and this was how I initially approached the topic and my empirical material, which I approached the topic myself and also the empirical material. So according to the traditional interpretation, domestic violence after the war should have been invisible, covered over by the restoration of the patriarchal gender order, the renewal of the traditional family, the desire to forget the war and violence in the war, and the cold, emotionless effort to secure one's own existence and build prosperity in West Germany, as diagnosed for post-war Germany, for example, by Hannah Arendt, or by the radical and often violent construction of a communist collectivist utopia in the case of Czechoslovakia. Indeed, if we look closely at contemporary documents and these criminal files and so on, especially the court files in Germany, the extent to which this recent past, the war and the Second World War and the violent experience made by many or by almost all male German during the war. So the extent to which this recent past was forgotten in post-war Germany is striking. Today, informed by the concept of trauma, which transformed the understanding of violence in the second half of the 20th century, we would likely assign central importance to the wartime experiences of perpetrators in any analysis of domestic violence in post-war society. However, in contemporary German documents from 1945, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1950, 51, 52, so in contemporary German documents, however, the wartime experience of men who returned home and where the wartime, I mean also this very extensive violence experience of these men who returned home from war and were violent toward their wives and children was silenced, overlooked, or entirely absent in these documents, in interviews, in testimonies, and all of them, all of these documents, this kind of experience was almost entirely absent. However, if you look more deeply, it becomes clear that domestic violence was somehow present. It was present in the ideas, discussions, and actions of contemporary society. It simply appeared in different contexts and with different meanings than today, or than what we would today expect, where we would maybe search for the violence. It could become a site where debates took place about the post-war morality of German society and about gender roles. It could also become the object of intense interest on the part of local and state authorities in connection with the moral panic of the first half of the 1950s. Also together as a part of a broader problem, together with other more or less serious forms of, and very, from our perspective, very different forms of violent conduct. The Czech case in post-war was similar. Domestic violence appeared in disputes and discussions about the state of the morality of the Czech nation, which many feared had been damaged by the poison of Nazism and by the demoralizing position of a subjugated, violated, or even raped nation during the German occupation. In later years, it could become, the topic of domestic violence could become partly visible as a symptom of the breakdown of marital cohabitation. Marriage was understood primarily as a social institution intended to ensure orderly and harmonious life together and the upbringing of children in the new socialized society. Domestic violence could also be framed as behavior that threatened the effort to build a better society, an effort the regime believed could be achieved through material development, the labor participation of all members of society, and public services such as free health care. This, of course, doesn't mean that domestic violence was the subject of some open public discussion. For many decades, it certainly was not, or only to a limited extent. As we know, in West Germany, the situation began to change significantly only from the mid or into late 1970s. The first women's shelter was opened in West Berlin in 1976 on the initiative of women from the New Women's Movement, and other cities followed. It was precisely the new women's movement that from the mid-1970s onward in Germany publicized the extent of male violence against women and children. So, but it was not the time of the post-war, and like 1945 till, I don't know, till 1955. The aim of the first chapter is rather to analyze and trace the process of the social visibilization of domestic violence in contexts that were significantly shaped after the war by the specific period of the post-war, and, in this general aspect, comparable, I think, on both sides of the newly erected Iron Curtain. The following chapters are organized thematically rather than chronologically. In the chapter about on society, I examine how specific social positions, the local ties of victims and perpetrators, and the ways they were perceived by those around them influenced the social visibility of violence. This was, after all, also the case in the already mentioned example of Jarmila, where factors external to the violence itself, to the act of violence itself, for example, how the perpetrator Karel behaved toward others, or how the community responded to him, played a substantial role in the fact that the violence Karel committed against Jarmila was for a long time not perceived, or was not wanted to be perceived by anyone. Gendered categories such as respectability and moral depravity played a particularly important role in this context. They shaped the social appearance of the victim and also perpetrators, and played a substantial role in the process by which domestic violence was constituted as a social phenomenon. Some victims were even denied the status of victim, as in the case of a 56-year-old Czech woman who became a victim for a long time, a victim of violence, including sexual violence at the hands of her brother. The police, who began investigating the perpetrator in 1952, believed his claim that his sister had had sex with him without resistance. I quote, "This may have suited the women," the investigating police officer commented on the perpetrator's testimony, "given her previous way of life. The women had previously been forced to prostitution by her former husband, an innkeeper, which, in the eyes of the investigator, made her someone who could not be raped at all." So he was like, her was the status of victim. He was not able, like, to be a victim of violence because of her, like, social appearance. The personality of victims and the way they appeared to those around them could limit the social visibility of violence they experienced. They became obstacles to the articulation of a specific personal experience of violence and prevented this individual experience from acquiring social relevance. In this chapter, I also focus on other categories, especially class, understood in this context more as a social cultural than a purely economic category, which significantly shaped the visibility of violence. Most of the cases of domestic violence that I studied, for example, in the Czech archives, concerned marginalized people from dysfunctional families. The perpetrators were often unskilled workers struggling with alcoholism. It would be entirely wrong, however, to draw any quantitative conclusions from this picture about the actual incidence of violence in different social classes. The fact that the lowest strata of society dominate the archival documents tell us nothing about the prevalence of domestic violence. It is only evidence of the class in which domestic violence was visible to those around it. So social and economic position, the breadth of social ties, and education also shaped the spaces in which victims could meaningfully articulate and communicate their experience of violence. From this perspective, one can observe certain differences, especially between rural Bavarian society concentrated around often highly patriarchal families functioning as independent economic units on the one hand, and the position of Czechoslovak women, who, thanks also to pressure on women's employment, found in their workplaces potentially new spaces of communication. But although these workplaces sometimes also became sites of sexual violence by male co-workers. Czechoslovak women also didn't necessarily suffer from the same degree of economic dependence on their partners. This was, however, as some German women or Bavarian women in some rural areas of Bavaria. This was, however, an ambivalent advantage of socialist women, often paid for by, for example, the extensive housing crisis, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, when spouses were forced to live together for many years, even after divorce, as was the case with already mentioned Jarmila and Karel. Perpetrators from the middle classes were not only less visible because this type of violence was not expected of them, they were also often able to use their social and economic capital to trivialize and marginalize the behavior they engaged in. Conversely, victims from the better classes, although they had sufficient social ties, the necessary education and social spaces, and so they were able to use social spaces in which they could articulate, meaningfully articulate and communicate their experience. So although they had access to these spaces and they had ability and education to articulate and to communicate their experiences, so although that, they often encountered specific expectations from their surroundings connected to their social position. So one example again, so what I mean with that problems of victims from middle classes. An example is a young woman from a small Czech town whom I will call Růžena, which is a very nice Czech name. Růžena lived in a well-situated outwardly exemplary marriage in late socialist Czechoslovakia. Her husband was a skilled craftsman, and she herself was the director of the local kindergarten and studied pedagogy, I think, at the university by distance learning. The young couple lived with their small children in a newly built terraced house. In reality, so they had also like some kind of contemporary, like middle class living standard, like an access to some consumption and so on. They also had a new car, and so on. In reality, however, Růžena was repeatedly the target of violence by her husband, and no one knew about. In this case, no one knew about the violence he perpetrated on Růžena. Only after one beating in July 1979 did Růžena, covered in bruises, decide to seek medical help. When she arrived in the local doctor's waiting room, however, she recognized that the ambulance driver on duty was the father of one of the children at the kindergarten she directed. She therefore quickly left without the doctor's waiting room, without being examined. And later she said, "I didn't want to disgrace myself or my husband." In the next, third chapter of the book, I focus on selected institutions, whether state or municipal, that as some gatekeepers formed a substantial part of the process through which domestic violence could or couldn't become socially visible and an object of institutional practice. Their very language, terminology, and classifications, the categories through which they thought about their work and reported on it, created a sieve of visibility or invisibility for domestic violence. I focused above all on institutions that, by their very nature, were in direct contact with concrete individuals and families. And it's also the selection of these institutions, of course, was also limited by the documents I could use and I was able to find. In the case of Bavaria, I was able to study documents of the Munich Caritas, the largest or one of the largest Catholic charitable organization in Bavaria, whose work directly involved working, like everyday working with people. And also I work with materials, with documents of the so-called municipal youth offices, Stadtjugendämter, municipal youth offices, that is, municipal institutions focused on children, youth, and families. In the Czech case, various commissions and departments concerned with children, family, women, or health, established under the national committees, and Czechoslovakia was made civil in Poland. In socialist Czechoslovakia, these national committees, národní výbory, they were organs of socialist state power and administration at the local level. So these different various committees and institutions proved particularly interesting, as did also in the Czech case. Also, I used also materials from marriage. I'm using from marriage and premarital counseling centers established especially from the 1970s onward. These materials are often, of course, fragmentary, randomly preserved and difficult to access. Nevertheless, in my view, they provide valuable insight into an important and specific area in which direct contact occurred between the state, the municipality, and ordinary people. At this intersection or point of contact, where the interests of the state, concepts of expert knowledge, and everyday life met, structures were formed that shaped the social visibility of domestic violence. It is interesting that despite major differences in the work, mission, and position of these and legal position of these institutions in the Czech and Bavarian cases, these lowest and most immediate levels of state and local administration appear well into the 1980s to have remained resistant or blind to domestic violence. This finding is surprising above all in the Bavarian case, given the radical shifts the topic of domestic violence had undergone in West German society no later than the late 1970s, when, as already mentioned, it first became a topic of public discussion and action. So in the case of this Bavarian charity, this Munich charity, the Caritas, the real breakthrough came only at the end of the 1980s. In November 1988, the heads of the individual counseling centers agreed. This is Caritas, and Caritas had and has different counseling centers in different cities in Bavaria. So the heads of these individual counseling centers agreed that they would address violence in families directly, newly, from this November 88. They were responding to a change, and the reason why they decided so to address right now the domestic violence directly. So they were responding to a changed social situation because public discussion, and I quote, increasingly enables more women and girls to speak openly about this still strongly tabooed problem. In 1988, one of the counseling centers recorded for the first time 6 girls who had been sexually abused by their fathers, stepfathers, or close acquaintances, as well as another 14 women who had experienced sexual violence by family members. Some of them spoke about it, and I quote, they spoke about him partly for the first time only in the course of counseling sessions. Similarly, a client of the Munich Counseling Center the same year, 88, stated that her father had abused her from the age of 10. I quote from the document, she remained silent like everyone else. The case of the Munich Caritas thus shows that the institutional language and practice determined whether domestic violence was statistically recorded, recognized in practice, voiced by victims, and grasped as an independent social problem. Thus, although various members of commissions for the family, and or in the Czech case, also many members of commissions for the family, or for women and children, as well employees of the Bavarian Catholic Charity, often possessed detailed and intimate knowledge of their clients and their family situations. They were unable or unwilling in their reports, and maybe also in their practice, to address and deal with the issues of domestic violence well into the 1980s. After analyzing post-war frameworks, society and institutions, however, one essential question remains, and it's the fourth chapter, the final chapter. How can one write the history of domestic violence in such a way that the experience of the victims themselves doesn't disappear? As I have tried to show, my approach to the history of domestic violence proceeds from a, let's say, traditional historical perspective, from the rejection of anachronism, that is, from the rejection of transferring present-day attitudes and understanding, such as the specific concept of domestic violence we have right now also anchored in the legal systems of both countries, like in Czechia and Germany. So from the rejection of this transferring of present day's attitudes and understanding into the past, or of understanding the past only as a preliminary stage of the present toward which it necessarily leads, and from whose perspective it should be judged. So this is, of course, this rejection of this anachronism is, of course, a traditional and I think also legitimate approach to the history writing. Yet, especially in the case of domestic violence, such an approach can quite legitimately raise several ethical questions. Is there not a danger that I will once again deprive victims of the reality of their experience, this time through a scholarly historical text? The risk is indeed not small. A historical position that interprets the thinking and actions of people in the past from within the contemporary frameworks in which they lived, and that doesn't wish to write the history as a preface to the present, can lead to the denial of the reality of the experience of violence and suffering in the past. It can dissolve that experience into contemporary marginalizing narratives that present, for example, domestic violence as a mere family squabble. It can once again silence experiences and voices that were already silenced in the past by focusing on the then dominant discursive network frameworks and social order of the time. An American literature historian, Ellen Scarry, offers an inspiring point of departure in her work on physical pain, where she understands it as a pre-discursive experience. The materials with which I have worked led to a similar idea. A critical reading of them showed that the framework through which violence was perceived could not erase the reality of the physical and psychological pain experienced by victims. Their actions testify to this. The pain, fear, and anger these victims felt were, despite all social or cultural conditions, real for them and strong enough to lead some of them to act in ways that made productive use of these contemporary conditions and often transcended them. Silence, too, could represent a form of agency, a strategy through which victims sought to preserve at least partial control over their own situation and dignity, as was the case, for example, maybe with Ruzhena. The fourth actor of the book is therefore the victims themselves. Understanding victims not as passive victims, but as potentially active actors in the social phenomenon we call domestic violence restores their voice and opens a new actor-centered perspective on its history. This is valuable both ethically and epistemologically. So the final chapter, not yet written, should therefore address domestic violence from the perspective of victims in terms of their agency, the actions and strategies they choose within a given contemporary framework in order to deal with their experience of violence and, where possible, to make it socially relevant, or conversely, to keep that experience silent. So, and some concluding questions, maybe questions, not a conclusion, maybe just maybe some questions, and which I'm also asking, which I ask while working on this project, on the book. So this question arises from the three main theses that I have tried to present today. So domestic violence should be studied as a phenomenon whose social visibility is historically produced. So it's not given. It was historically, social visibility as something which has been historically produced. So domestic violence. The history of domestic violence cannot be written as a simple path from silence to recognition, and the everyday reality of violence must be analyzed at the intersection of I try to analyze it at the intersection of contemporary frameworks, institutions, social relations, and the agency of victims. So my questions, maybe some little bit little complicated or speculative. The first, which I'm asking myself, the first of these more general questions concerns the periodization of the post-war period. Instead of the usual periodization based mainly on political milestones, in the case of Czechoslovakia, the traditional milestone is the communist takeover in February 1948, I have decided to treat the post-war period rather as a specific and coherent period. So in my definition, it's very provisory, like the 10 years between 1945 and 1955. This is not only because it enables a Czech-German comparison, but also because, for example, continuities across 1948 can be traced in several policy areas in Czechoslovakia. Another question I ask concerns how to trace or how to understand the influence of modernization, the influence of political and other discourses and policies on everyday practice in the field of domestic violence. Of course, these influences are visible in both Czech and Bavarian society, but they were by no means direct or immediate. Modernizing policies of the post-war, whether in the sense of West German liberalization and westernization, or in the form of Czechoslovakia's radical and often violent post-war construction of a new society and a new socialist man. So these modernizing policies of the post-war often ran up against the persistence of social ideas and local practices, which can be described as a longue durée of Central European mentalities. From this perspective, it may be appropriate to historize the era of socialism in Central and Eastern Europe as a significant, yet still only episodic moment in the region's longer history. At the same time, however, the political, economic, and social transformations of the dynamic 4 post-war decades from 1945 to, let's say, to the 1980s, so this very dynamic 4 decades, 4 post-war decades, to which my work is devoted, must not be underestimated. Instead of presuming a direct influence of elite policies and discourses, I try, or my analysis seeks to trace how they shaped the discursive structure and praxeological conditions within which contemporaries navigated their everyday lives. So not as a direct impact of some new policies, of some elite discourses on everyday practice, but more something that shaped the general condition within which people had to live their everyday lives, and they tried to understand what was happening and try to understand also the domestic violence. This brings me to the final question, which is the question about power. And this may be a little bit complicated, I don't know, I'm not very well, maybe not very clear. But okay, I can ask this question. So it's the question about power. So this brings me to the final question, which concerns the possibilities and methods of researching everyday life. Socialist everyday life, in particular, is usually studied either from the perspective of the concept of Eigensinn, which, as I've already suggested, rightly points to the limits of political power, especially authoritarian power from above, in everyday practice. Everyday life is understood here as a site of negotiation, modification, and adaptation, as well as of the specific instrumentalization of this power from above, from everyday practice and for everyday life. Nevertheless, even in this conception, political power remains the central category in the analysis of everyday life. A second approach, more often found in popular studies, not academic texts maybe, the second approach abstracts from political power to a considerable extent and depicts everyday life during socialism as a specific world of ordinary daily existence, often from the perspective of consumption. The topic of domestic violence, in my view, forces us, or me, to seek an interpretative position between this fascination with political power, on the one hand, as the central category of central life, of everyday life, and the extensive neglect of political power characteristic of the second approach. So this was my an attempt to present my research and to present my book and how I am thinking about the topic of domestic violence, how I am trying to approach the topic, how I am researching the topic, and thank you for your attention, and I'm looking for your questions and comments and so on. Thank you.
Thank you for thank you, Ota, for your very interesting lecture. And right now we have some time to raise questions to discuss the topic. Please. So perhaps we will collect 3 questions in each turn, okay, in round, and then Ota will answer them. Okay, so starting.
Okay, Michał Zock, German Historical Institute. Thank you for your interesting presentation. It's rather a comment. The thing about Western Germany or Bavarian, your Bavarian example, and your question about periodization, I think it would be interesting to look at the at the legal framing, because we have a very important occurrence in 1977, that is the change in the divorce law in Western Germany.
What?
Law on divorce.
Yeah, divorce.
Because as far as I can remember, it removed the principle of guilt, so that if we have a marital breakdown, so that women, predominantly women, could either get out of a marriage with a, for example, brutal husband. One effect, as far as I remember, of this was that actually the amount of wives killing husbands dropped.
Yeah.
So, but what you told us about Bavaria in, let's say, in the decade after 1977 is that nothing has changed. That we have still domestic violence, that it is silenced. And I ask myself, okay, in Bavaria, let's say in this rural regions, I can think of some factors that determined women to be silenced. And I know that this is also the case in other countries. I myself did research on Ireland, and it was basically the same. It was always about economic dependence of women on men, and so on and so on. So the question I would have is, or the hint, it would be interesting to look, why didn't it change in the 1980s in Bavaria when the law changed, and what were the factors that women stayed or were silenced about this problem? Thank you.
Next question, please. I don't know who was the next.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Andrew Tompkins. I am also at the German Historical Institute, Warsaw. I found it interesting that I don't think I heard you mention masculinity. And I'm wondering if this is a concept that you think would help you either to with some of the problems that you're looking at. I think that, for example, Frank Bies or Robert Möller, people like that who've also written about this kind of departure, the early post-war period as one of the reconstruction of patriarchy, that they would talk about this in terms of reconstructions of masculinity, fragile masculinities, that sort of thing. In terms of periodization, I have a sort of comment/question. I think it sounds like you've begun to periodize it practically in terms of this reconstruction of patriarchy. And it seems that the only kind of way to meaningfully periodize something like this would also depend largely on women's actions and women's agency. And this brings me to a bit of a question. Presumably, in the two contexts that you're looking at, these are not going to align in an easy and convenient way for your periodization. So I'm wondering, how do you aim to address that, particularly without reproducing a kind of happy Western narrative that posits Eastern Europe as being behind? Sorry, East Central Europe.
Okay, who's next?
I think I'm next. I already had the occasion to introduce myself. And thanks also for this great lecture. And it reminded me of a research that I did many years ago on early post-war visual cultures in Germany, both in the West and the East. And back then I read through hundreds of women's magazines, and also I looked especially at the images, and I didn't look back then at the topic of domestic violence, because, as you can imagine, it was not addressed immediately. But now, when I was listening to you and went back in my mind through this material, I realized that there was much of the topic of domestic violence was there, but somehow between the lines and between the images. For example, in the early 1950s, in the magazine Constanze, which was the most popular women's magazine in Western Germany, there was a debate whether it's better to have a bad husband or no husband.
No husband, yeah.
And a huge debate over many issues, and the answer was clear: a bad husband is
better,
definitely better than no husband. In many women's magazines, there were also advertisements of makeup articles. Extremely many of them, and the official narrative was that it was to cover up the fact that women are working and it's bad for their skin and so on. But now when I was listening to you, I thought maybe there was also a hidden message that makeup articles are to hide up or cover up signs of domestic violence. And last issue, in the late 1940s, there were in each occupation zone of Germany, there were huge campaigns anti-venereal diseases, publicly very visible. Each occupation zone had their own strategy. And also here in this campaign, sexual violence was, well, I would say quite clearly mentioned. In this case, not really between the lines, because venereal diseases were seen as a threat to the new post-war society. So this was more of a comment or a question whether you look also at women's magazines and some arguments to do that. And my question would be about the reason why you look specifically at Bavaria, because Bavaria is not West Germany, I would say. In this case, not only because it's Catholic and conservative and so on, but also especially for the early post-war period, the American occupation powers had different policies when it came to family policy and also sexual issues than, for example, the British or the French.
Okay. So I suggest to just to let our guests to answer those questions, and then we'll have another round of questions.
Yeah, the first question about legal framing and family law, divorces, and so on. Yeah, I didn't mention it. Of course, there were also a lot of changes in Czechoslovak law at the end of 1940s after this communist coup d'état, and there was a lot of literature about this socialist approach to legal approach to family and so on, to family law. And you are right, of course, in West Germany, like a very important reform of family law and also of criminal law in the 1970s, starting already in 1960s discussion, and then especially in the 1970s. So also the question of also of sexual offenses and so on. Yeah, so that's right. I know. I was really surprised. So I tried. I know all of this legal framework and so on, and I will of course address it in my book and so on. But still, I was also surprised during my research and during reading these documents from the, let's say, everyday life, and from the lowest level of everyday life. So I was really surprised how limited the impact of these changes and modernizations and reforms and so on was on the practice, and even on the practice of local administration, and also on the practice of local judicial systems and so on. An example, for example, in Czechoslovakia, it was very important change in Czechoslovakia. During the reform of the family law and criminal law at the end of 1940s, the beginning of the 1950s, the marital rape was acknowledged. So it was something which didn't happen in Germany till 1990s. So, And also that was possible, that that from the legal point of view, husband could rape her wife. And because of the new concept of family as a marriage of two independent and equal human beings, men and women, and so on. But when I didn't make any systematic research of rape and so on in the in the Czechoslovakia, but still. My feeling was that the local courts and the local police and so on still made a distinction in the practice between rape, which happened or which occurred, for example, after divorce, and rape, which occurred during divorce, which was, from the legal point, completely didn't make any sense. Of course, it was a rape. But still, in practice, they still had in heads this distinction between that when it happened during the marriage, it was still rape, but less serious, but the rape which happened after the divorce. And in many cases, as I mentioned, a lot of people were forced to live together many years in the same small flat after the divorce. So that you can imagine that the situation was horrible for example, especially for women. And so the courts and police, they still distinguish between these two types of rape. So my feeling was and is that, again, and this is one of my questions, I was really surprised, because when we are speaking, for example, about West Germany, we are speaking about modernization, we are speaking about westernization, about democratization, liberalization, and so on. And of course, a lot of things happened during 1960s, 1970s, and so on, and open public debates and so on. But still looking into the everyday life, so then my feeling was that the impact was not immediate. There was an impact, but not immediate, in the meaning new reform of the family law 1977, okay, new behavior of people in 1978, for example. No, at all. So maybe my answer to your question, and I tried, and I really depend on my documents and on the access to the documents, which was especially in Germany quite difficult because of the anonymization of the personal rights of people, which is very understandable. And so my documents, my last documents, let's say, are from the late 1980s, but not a lot of documents from that time. So most of the documents I have, especially these criminal files, are from 90 till the beginning of 1980s, let's say. So that's also my approach is also, and I know, so I started with, to be honest, I started with an idea, okay, I will write a book about post-war, till 1950s. And there I researched some archival documents, and I didn't find any changes, any development in the document. Okay, then I will try to have a look in the 1960s. Something must change in the 1960s, because of 1960s. Almost nothing has changed. So 1970s, almost nothing has changed. 1980s, something has little changed. Maybe I have to have some documents from 1990s or 2000s, something, but I don't have access to these documents. So that's masculinity. Yeah, thank you. That's of course very important question. You are right. There are also some research about masculinity, also masculinity and domestic violence, and so on. I approach this topic a little bit, especially in the chapter about the post-war period, because, as you mentioned, the reconstruction masculinity after the war was the main issue one of the main issues of post-war Germany, and not only in Germany, also in Czechoslovakia, from different perspectives, from the perspective of a nation which was occupied by arch enemy, by Germany. But it's not the main category of my research. But if you ask why, I don't have any specific answer why. Maybe, yeah. But I understand what you mean. It's part of especially in the post-war period, but it's not the central category of my analysis. women's agency and periodization. I'm not sure if I understood you correctly. The problem is, so I have a lot of like small histories, like I already mentioned, like history for Ruzhina, history for very small histories, and it's very difficult to create a coherent narrative based on these histories, and it's very difficult to make a periodization, to see a change in these histories, because you have like very individual stories, which were in many cases, which depended in many cases on very different conditions and so on. So it's very difficult to make, like, as a social scientist, so you need to have like data, you need to have some comparable data, then you can make some conclusions about development, about like hidden structures and so on. In this case, it's very, very difficult to make some or to see some development. And that's why I'm trying to approach the domestic violence more as a like social phenomenon, and trying to see the mechanisms of social visibility, how the domestic violence became visible. And the periodization is maybe, or to reconstruct some development is maybe not the main, it's not my main aim, let's say, of my research. And I'm not sure if I would be able to create some or to reconstruct.
May I jump in? Because when I was listening to you, I thought that quite an obvious caesura would be probably the generational shift between the generation that experienced war violence and for which violence was more or less normal way of solving problems, and the post-war generation. I mean, just a thought, but that might be more relevant than any political change.
Yeah, of course. I think like when we are speaking about caesura and change, I think the 1970s and 1980s are definitely like not maybe 1960s, but I would say so the 1970s, 1980s as a change, and also a little bit in the case of Czechoslovakia. But because of different reasons, like 90. But still, it's very general claim, So I can say it, but I'm not able to prove it using any kind of data and so on. So I can somehow like say or write, okay, there was some. It seems that there was some change in 1970s, 1980s, and there was a change, but still, it's not like something like that. Okay, many thanks for your suggestions about visual culture in post-war Germany, journals and so on. That's a good point. Your question, I'm not. That's not my main focus to study like press. I'm a little bit I'm using a research which was made by one of my PhD students about the domestic violence in the Czechoslovak women's magazine Vlasta. So she was really able to go through all of because the Vlasta was not digitalized. I think she was able to go through all numbers and volumes of this women's magazine, which was very important and still is very important and it was the women magazine in the socialist Czechoslovakia. So I'm partly using her like conclusions, but it's not the main empirical basis of my research. And again, so I was overwhelmed by other materials, and I was not able to deal with other. And again, so I see also your questions and other questions. I was also asked at by other presentations of my work. So you can see that's like something. That's a huge area. That's a huge topic, which could be like research from different perspectives. So I just decided for this one perspective based mainly on like archival documents, and I'm trying to reconstruct the social, let's say, the dynamic and the social mechanism, but of course it's important. And yeah, what you mentioned, it's something which I'm also trying to to show, or I'm also trying to describe in my first chapter about post-war, that domestic violence was there, but in different contexts, not as a domestic violence as we understand domestic violence now, but in different contexts, like as you mentioned, in the context of venereal diseases, maybe in the context of makeup advertisements. That's very good. That's a very interesting idea, or maybe. And also in the context, I was quite surprised in the context how it was almost directly addressed, the domestic violence in the context of this moral panic in the first half of the 1950s. But again, not as a domestic violence, from a different point of view. So that's one of my, let's say, conclusion of the first chapter is that domestic violence was not invisible, it was not unpresent, domestic violence was there, but not as a domestic violence, in different contexts, and these contexts were shaped by this very specific German post-war situation. Why Bavaria? Yeah, okay, so it's very funny because a lot of German colleagues ask why Bavaria, and Bavaria is not Germany, and so on. There are some maybe more serious reasons why Bavaria, and less it's a little bit a coincidence, because I spent, as I mentioned, some time in Munich at the university during my fellowship, and also later. So I had the possibility and I had the access to Bavarian archives. And it was very time demanding because of this personal rights. I was not able to make any photos of the documents. So I have to typewrite, I have to make my notices, and you can imagine that takes a long of time. So if you had like criminal file with 3 volumes, so it takes 1 week to go through and to make notices and so on. That's why. So I had the opportunity to spend long time in Bavaria, so I had the opportunity and I had the access to the archives, and also, to be honest, the Bavarian archives are really good. And finally I get access to the complete collections of criminal files of local Bavarian courts from Munich, from Regensburg, from Nuremberg, and so on. That was really huge and really very interesting collection of documents. So that's why more coincidence. Also, secondly, I think it makes somehow sense because it's a little bit also a transnational history what I'm writing, because a lot of Sudeten German were forced to migrate to Bavaria after the Second World War, and there was some really interesting also connections between Bavaria and Bohemia or Czech lands. And also, I think from the point of view of culture, of mentalities, and so on, so it's somehow these two cases are somehow comparable, but at the same time very different after 1945. Very conservative, as you mentioned, very conservative region with communist, socialist, progressive ideas of a new socialist society. That was also one thing why I decided, okay, that makes sense to compare these two regions. But you are right, so that's I could, for example. And it's the last thing, I highlighted, I mentioned that this rural region of Bavaria, but I'm not dealing only with rural region of Bavaria. My documents are also from Munich, and also I know that Bavaria was not as industrialized as, for example, North Rhine-Westphalia and so on, but still, or Ruhrgebiet and so on, but still, it was quite it became industrialized during 1950s, 1960s. So I have documents not only from this rural, backward, let's say, regions, but also from urban centers and so on.
Okay, we can afford ourselves another round of questions.
And I was thinking about jumping into your jumping and continue this because thank you for a very interesting lecture. Thank you for what you said about the modernization and influence of modernization. And that's why I would like to ask you if you see the changes, not administrative changes, not in the categories of law and so on, but the changes which Barbara Klich-Kluczewska describes as emotional revolution in Polish families, which makes domestic violence a violence. Because this is a basic question. What is a violence? I think that, as you said just a few minutes ago, this domestic violence was quite visible. And it makes me to think if it was really private. Because I think it was not exactly private. Everybody knew about it. Like in the story about Karel and Jarmila, yes? Everybody knew. And if Karel, for example, didn't exaggerate, it was okay. It was tolerable. But then he just make it intolerable, and that's why it became defined as violence. So this is my question. What we define as violence, and I think that for a long time, just like child beating, wife beating, if of course not too hard, it was okay. It was a kind of normal behavior in the family. And then something happened that it became conceptualized as violence. And I think it's more about modernization in terms of this emotional revolution than administrative changes. And my short question is, if it's only about women being victims of violence, and when, if ever, men appeared in your sources as victims, and also children. Because, for example, in Polish sources, in Polish public discourse, and here I mean the media, it's in the 80s when men appear as victims. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this rich presentation, especially rich in this theoretical framework. And I have two questions. The first one is, how do you approach this issue, this challenge of those who are socially, culturally, even sometimes even legally constructed as not being able to be a subject of domestic violence? I mean, mostly men, as this we see it through that being constructed socially as laughable matter, or we also see it like sexual violence against children was only for many years connected to girls being the one in the legal framework as being able to be constructed or as a victim of violence, not boys. So that's my question about this big issue of those who are not being able to be subjects of domestic violence. And the second one I really find inspiring. You mentioned of mesoliths, and I really thought that in Poland for many years there's frameworks that pushed the physicians or the schools to act against physical violence were very much connected with alcohol use prevention. In Poland it was, for example, the Blue Card, the most popular, I would say, framework was connected with State Agency of the Prevention of Alcohol-Related Problems. And my question is, how do you think, maybe it's, have you seen if it's intertwined differently, for example, in West Germany and socialist countries, in Czechoslovakia, this connections between alcohol use prevention and domestic violence and the domestic violence that was not connected with the alcohol use, making it less and less visible? And when do you see the change that we see the violence that is not connected to the alcohol use? Thank you very much.
And if you can hand over the mic. Yes, thank you.
Jan Musekam from German Historical Institute. Thank you very much for your presentation. And it seems with all the questions you need to write another book. My question, I keep it very short. When I want to expand Magda's question about the sense of comparing, let's say, Bohemia and Bavaria, My question would be, where do you see the real division lines in the research, the material you studied? So is it really like the political system? Is it about Czech or German or / Bavarian, if you want? Or is it more about urban versus rural? Is it more about, let's say, also Catholic, Protestant, non-believer? So where are the real division lines? I mean, that is the good thing about these comparisons across borders. You can probably uncover things that you would take for granted, but then you see maybe the socialist village is pretty close to the Bavarian village, even if it seems like that's not possible. Yeah? So I wanted to ask you about the experience you had with studying the material.
Thank you. So, please, if you can answer the questions.
For questions. I don't know if I will be able to answer these questions in detail. So your question about it's a very good topic, and thank you. It's like very interesting to think about modernization not only in terms of like administrative, social, economic, political modernization, but also in terms of like emotional revolution. And so I write. Something happened in the 1970s, 1980s. You are right. It's also somehow connected to, in the case of Czechoslovakia, to this marriage counseling centers and premarital counseling centers, which were, to be honest, at the beginning founded because of the state was frightened by the number of divorces and so on, and state tried to keep the society like society with traditional families, with children and so on. Also from the economic, because of economic reasons, like to have like workforce for the future and so on. So the reasons were not these emotional reasons, but the reasons were very economic, like thinking of late socialism. But I think, so it might be also framed as a part of this emotional revolution. There's, I think, one point, and it is something which I found in the Czech cases and in German or Bavarian cases as well. So that this concept, this context of for the 1970s, 1980s, especially for these counseling centers in counseling centers of marriage counseling centers in Czechoslovakia, or in the case of some like Stadtjugendämter and so on in Germany. So the general context of understanding the family and the conflicts in family, well the concept of the marriage conflicts, of conflicts between husband and wife and between children and so on, and the way how to, and what was new, of course, was this acknowledgement of the conflicts, and that the conflict is bad, and that we need a harmony in family, and we need we need to have a love in family and so on. But the way how to deal with these conflicts was a therapy, like to not, and it's quite difficult to have a therapy with a perpetrator of violence, or to have like therapy with both with husband and wife, as a therapy when husband was very like violent against wife. So I think on one hand you are right. So that something happened in 1970s, 1980s, more like approach, more like focus on emotional life, more focus on personal life, on individual life of people, on individual happiness of people living in a family. But at the same time, this context of family conflicts didn't enable to, in my opinion, to see domestic violence as a violence. So it was perceived, from my opinion, it was perceived also in the context as again, in the framework of family conflicts or conflicts between two equal partners, two equal human beings, and not as a topic of domestic violence. Domestic violence is something which is not about like two equal partners in a marriage. Yeah, but that's really good, like to think about this modernization in terms not only as a political and administrative or social economic modernization, but also as emotional modernization. And yeah, was domestic violence really private? Yeah, so yeah, it was not private, so of course. So it was like also the concept domestic violence is part of this, it's very questionable topic, of course. It's very questionable terminology to use domestic violence, because it seems that this violence is something which is a private thing, which doesn't happen in, no one knows about that, and that's not true, of course. Yeah, so it was not, also it was not public in the sense I tried to explain it at the beginning of my talk. So because the public violence is something different, because for the public violence, this publicity is the main framework and is the main motivation. In many cases, also something which is reason for a specific kind of violence, of performative, violent spectacles, which happened, for example, in the post-war on the streets and in the squares of post-war cities. So there are different types of violence, but yeah, you are right. So also from my reading of the privacy. Yeah, and the privacy, of course, has changed during the time as well. So yeah. But you are right, so it was also my feeling from documents I read that we can't speak about something which was hidden. It was not hidden, but it was present, but in different contexts that today, for example. That's maybe what I try to say. Yeah, thank you for your question about and also that's also a question about men and boys. No, I don't have almost any man as a victim of violence in my materials, which again is not about, and boys yes, it's about less, of course, very less than girls, and it's the same thing as with these lower strata of society which are very represent a lot of people. Okay, otherwise, so it's not about the numbers of quantity of violence, but it's because the violence against men, sexual violence, domestic violence against men was even more invisible than violence against men, because of this masculinity, because men were not seen as capable to be victim, because of this masculinity to be victims of violence. And as you mentioned, when sometimes there are some indirect traces of some violence against men, and as you mentioned, it was framed as something which was laughable, which was something kind of irony, like joke and so on. So it was not seen as a violence at all. So it was even more tabooed than violence against women. But yeah, boys, there were some cases, boys as a victims of sexual violence, of their fathers or stepfathers and so on, and also, of course, violence against children. It's another wide topic, another book, and so on. And so for me, it's a question how to bring together these different types of violence against women, violence against girls, violence against children, violence against boys, and so how to bring it together. And I'm trying to bring it together by using this concept of violence as a social phenomenon and so on. So meso-elites, alcohol, very good question. Alcoholism, I didn't mention it in my talk, but alcoholism was one of the very important frameworks in which domestic violence was presented and was perceived and was understood, especially in Czechoslovakia in 1950s, 1960s. So it was, when something happened, it was not because, and when something was convinced by the court, it was not because of domestic violence, but it was because alcoholism. And domestic violence was somehow part of this alcoholism. So that was the main framework, or main object, or I don't know, how people understood and saw domestic violence. So through the eyes of the alcoholism, through the optic of the alcoholism. And you are right, there was some difference between Bavaria and Czechia. So in Bavaria, the alcoholism didn't play as important role as a framework of domestic violence as in the case of Czechoslovakia. In post-war Bavaria, the most important framework of domestic violence, or where domestic violence appeared, was social problems of this broken post-war German society, of broken post-war German families and so on. That was the main framework. But in the case of Czechoslovakia, other pathology, and in that case the pathology, the social pathology of alcoholism was the most important, perspective in which domestic violence could appear or could be somehow present for the contemporaries. Thank you also for the question. Division between Czechia and Bavaria. To be honest, I was surprised that at the beginning I expected to find more differences between Czechia and Bavaria in the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s and so on. And there were a lot of differences, of course, but not the political one, I think, not the most important. When, then, indirectly. As for example, I think that some Czech women had more possibilities to articulate and communicate what happened to them because they worked in some factories in the 1950s. So unlike some German women living in this rural area in Bavaria, so with her husband and with her family. So indirect general conditions which were different in the case of Czechoslovakia in 1950s partly, and Bavaria in 1950s. Also different conditions, very different. The big difference is in post-war German society and post-war Czech society. So post-war German society, the condition of post-war German society was more very serious, very, very difficult. So broken social ties, broken families. So it was not comparable to post-war Czech society, to be honest. So here I think it was the most striking difference between Bavaria and Czechoslovakia and Czechia in this post-war situation and post-war society, situation of post-war societies. But I was quite surprised that so regarding the behavior of people and also regarding the behavior of some police and so on. So the differences were not as important as I thought at the beginning. But still, again, and it's again more than feeling that I can't prove it because I don't have the data. So again, feeling something changed happened in the 1970s, and you can see that people acted a little bit different in 1970s in Bavaria than in Czechoslovakia. So more it's banal, but more self-conscious, conscious. And they also had a more possibilities how to address, how to articulate, especially in cities in the 1970s, how to articulate, how to address their problems or their experiences than in Czech society, I think, in the 1970s. But still, really, I was really quite surprised by how both societies were comparable, at least till 1970s, 1960s.
Okay, thank you, Ota, for your lecture once again. Thank you all for attending this meeting. It was our pleasure, the pleasure of Faculty of History to host you. And of the Institute of the German Historical Institute in Warsaw as well. So thank you very much and see you next time.